So we're on Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph. We're towards the top of the Amud. And let's see how many lines down. We're basically She'imata Omer Choletzes Misyabemes. Let's see if we can find that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 lines down from the top. So Imata Omer, right? We're talking about this concept of a chumrah. What do we call it? A chumrah shemevil lidei takolim. Was that the phrase? Right. Chumrah di asi lidei kul. That was on Lamed Omid Beis. And if you're going to tell me that choletzes, that in the case of Safed, that she requires chalitza misafed, then people might jump the gun and go one step further and assume that there's also mitzvahs yibum. If there was no mitzvahs yibum, why would there be a requirement of chalitza? So the minds of the spectators, they begin to think that there's a choice here of yibum or chalitza. Because generally speaking, that's the case. You know, if a woman needs chalitza, then she also needs yibum, or she falls for yibum. So therefore, if they see that she's getting chalitza, they're going to say that she should get yibum as well, like any other yivam. And here, this is the case that we discussed yesterday at great length, where she's asur l'syavim. She's not allowed to have yibum. Why? Because she has a chazaka b'tzaras erva, right? And tzaras erva is muteris l'shuk, and she becomes eishes achiv, and there's an Isser violation of an Isser kares. So we have to worry about an Isser kares. And therefore the Gemara is arguing now that we should not impose a chumrah of chalitza, because that's a very dangerous chumrah to require chalitza, which might lead to a michshol of a violation of an Isser kares if they're going to be mater her for yibum. And that's a case of a woman who has a cheskes tzaras erva, and therefore she's eishes ach. So the Gemara now says, if that is the logic that you're operating in, that every single time a woman gets chalitza, we have to be choshesh that maybe people will think that she's re'uya liyibum, is hachanami. In our case of Safek Kedushin, we said that midrabanan, right, Sarah is going to require chalitza. The imata omer choletzes is they will come to say misyabemes. And this is the Gemara's final conclusion here about the argument of chumrah sha'asi lidei kula, that you're being machmir to prohibit yibum, because you're telling me that the kiddushin to what was her name? Rivka was, who was an erva, was Kiddushay Safek. And insofar as you're creating a Kiddushay Safek, you're now prohibiting the Sarah, the other Sarah from Yibum. So we should be choshesh that maybe he'll come to be Miyavim Sarah's erva. So once again, we're back to square one as to why we're choshesh in the case of Safek Gerushin, but not in the case of Safek Kedushin. Right? Rabbi had made a whole presentation that the reason why the Mishnah avoided a case of Safek, right, where Zarak Laget, Karavlo, and all that business, is because we want to avoid this kind of a takola. But in Safek Kedushin, he's not worried about a takola. The same takola that if you say choletzes, they might come to assume that there's Yibum, and now we have a Kiddushay Safek Erva, we have to be worried about that as well. So we're still stuck up in the air. We're trying to justify Rabba's distinction and answer the question why the Mishnah avoided Safek in the case of Gerish. So the Gemara answers that, you know what, there's a difference between Kiddushin and Safek Kiddushin and Safek Gerushin. Why is that? Why is there no chashash in the case of Safek Kedushin? And the answer is tisyavim ve'im b'kach chlum. Right? What's going to be the worst case scenario? That he might come to think, well, she requires chalitza, let me go ahead and do yibum, or that's what the people are going to think. he doesn't violate any Isur, because according to the Doraisa, she is actually Muteres Lisyamin. She does fall for Yibum. Why? Because we're not going to change her status on a Doraisa level of Cheskas Eter Liyavama, Yibum. We're not going to assume that the marriage to Rivka, who is the Erva, was a marriage that went through and it's valid, because that would imply that we undermine the Cheskas Eter Liyavam and a Chazaka Kakaima. That as far as the Chazaka is concerned, she is Muteres Liyibam. So even if they're going to be Machmir, Mitzad Sofek, when the Torah is not Machmir, the Torah relies on Chazaka, and they're not going to allow for Yibum, we're not going to worry about Chalitza. We're not going to say, well, don't give Chalitza. What do you mean, don't give Chalitza? The Rabbanan want to impose a requirement of Chalitza because of the possibility that maybe she, but no, I'm forgetting about the Rabbanan, right? The Torah requires Chalitza because as far as the Torah is concerned, she falls for Yibum because of her Chazaka. But now you're going to say, wait a minute, how can we impose Chazaka? We have to worry about the possibility that it might come to Yibum. Well, the answer is, who cares if it comes to Yibum? That's exactly what the Torah says. The Torah wants us to be Yibum. It's the Rabbanan who are Choshesh, and they created a Safek Kiddushin. The Torah itself relied on a Chazaka that there is no Kiddushin, and therefore the status of Sarah is not one of a Tzara's error. Abaye, now Abaye asks a different kasha to Rava from a Mishnah later on in Masechet Yevamot. Nafal Habayis Olav Vial Bas Achiv. So we're talking about a man who married the daughter of his brother, and both never perished in a collapse. Now, this person, we'll give him a name in just a second as we go through the case. He had another wife besides his niece, and she was Saras Bas Achi. V'ein yodua ezim hameis rishon. We don't know in that terrible tragedy. Right, I'm thinking of Florida not long ago, right, and Iran, right, in all these cases. We don't know who died first. Was it the Baal or his niece, meaning his wife? Okay, now let's give it names. He has Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Reuven has a daughter by the name of Rivka. And Shimon marries a woman, let's say, named Sarah, and then he marries, or I don't think the sequence, and then he marries Rivka as well, who is his niece. Now, Sarah, he says Sarah, right? Sarah is the erva to Reuven. Do we get this right? Right? Shimon married Reuven's daughter. No. My mistake. Reuven's daughter was Rivka, not Sarah. Okay, so Rivka is the erva, and Sarah is, let's say, potentially a Tsaras erva. Now, status quo at one moment in time, before this whole suffix, before this whole collapse, the status of Sarah was that of a Tsaras erva, because Shimon is married to both Sarah and his niece Rivka, Reuven's daughter. So that's called a cheskas heter l'shur. Meaning, right now we have every reason to assume that if Shimon dies, then his wife Sarah could marry anyone because she's a Tsaras erva. Okay, fine. Now what happens? The house collapses on both Shimon and Rivka. They both perish. We don't know who died first. Now, what's the status of Sarah? as far as falling for Yibum to Reuven. If Shimon died first, and then Rivka died, then Yibum is out of the question. Why? Because at the moment of Nefila Yibum, with Shimon's death, the status of Sarah is that of its Sarah's Erva. Correct? Because what happens is if a person dies and he's married to two women, at the moment of his death, those two women fall for Yibum. One of them is Rivka, who's a daughter to Reuven. She's an Erva to Reuven, and therefore Sarah is a free agent. She's a Tzaras Erva. Tzaras Erva can marry without Chalitza. However, let's say that Rivka died first, right? If Rivka died first, then at the moment, subsequently, when Shimon dies, Sarah is not a Tzaras Erva because the Erva no longer exists. So at the critical moment of Misa, when Shimon dies, that's going to thrust Sarah into a Yibum situation to Reuven. She's no longer a Tzaras Erva because at the time of the Misa of the Baal, she's not a Tzaras Erva. So what do we do in this case where we don't know whether Sarah is or is not a Tzaras Erva? So Abai quotes a Mishnah later on in Masechet Yevamot that says, Sarasa choletzes v'lo misyabenes, which means the following, that on the one hand, we're going to have to require chalitza, that Sarah, in order to get married to anyone min hashuk, she must have chalitza from Reuven because it could very well be that Rivka died first. And if Rivka died first, and then Shimon died, when Shimon died, Sarah, her status is Yevamot. She falls for Yibum, she's not a Tzaras Erva. On the other hand, Lo Misyabemes, because it's quite possible that Shimon died first. And if Shimon died first, then at the moment of Shimon's death, Sarah is a Tzaras Erva, because right now, Rivka is alive and well. So therefore, as a Tzaras Erva, correct? So again, let's just go over one more time. If Rivka died first, then Sarah is not a Tzaras Erva, and at the very least she needs Chalitza, correct? If on the other hand Shimon died first, then Sarah is not in the parish of Yibum, she's a Tzaras Erva, and therefore she would be Eishes Ach with an Isakaris to Reuven, so we can't allow Yibum. It's okay to allow Chalitza. So now we're going to see how Abaye proves, or I should say disproves, maybe that would be a better word, disproves Rabbah based on this Mishnah, Amai. Why isn't this a case of Safek Gerushin? Right? We don't know in the case of Rabbah, let's go back a little bit, backtrack to Rabbah. We don't know whether or not Shimon was Megaresh Rivka the Erva. And here also, we don't know if Rivka the Erva died before Shimon died. So it's a parallel case. Now, according to the logic of Rabbah, we go back to the Cheskes Heter L'Shuk in this case of Gerushin, correct? What do I mean by Heter L'Shuk? Sarah had a chazak of being a Tzaras Erva and not falling for Yibum. It's Hachinami. Why don't we apply your yardstick, your logic, Rabbah, to the case of the Nephilas bias? And Nema, we should say, Isha Zu Sarah, who at one point was the Tzara of Rivka, has a Cheskes Heter L'Shuk. Meaning before this tragedy took place, certainly we could assume that the status of Sarah anticipating Chas V'Sholom the death of her husband Shimon is that of a Tzaras Erva, because now Rivka is alive and well. And according to your logic, Rabba, we should apply the principle of Cheskes Hetel Shuk Omedes. And therefore, just like in the case of Gerushin, where we assume that the Gerushin is a non-starter, here too we should assume when the husband died that at that moment in time Rivka is still alive, right? Because the death of Rivka is like the Gerushin of Rivka in the case of Rabbah. According to your logic, Rabbah, we have a principle of someone who has a cheskes heter. In this case, Sarah has a cheskes heter l'shuk because we have every reason to assume, until we prove otherwise, that she's a tzaras erva. Here too, we should say al tasrenu misafik. Why do you assume? Why does the Mishnah assume choletzes v'lo mitzia bemes? The brilliant question of Abaye. Now, the only thing is that, in a certain sense, Abaye, I think, is being unfair to Rabba. Because the concept of Cheskes Hetel Shuk in Rabba's frame of reference was only on a Doraisa level. But Rabba agrees that on a Darabanan level, you require Chalitza because we're always afraid that maybe the get was valid. And here also, we have to be afraid that perhaps, what's her name? Rivka died before Shimon. I think that's what he's going to say now. And if you'll answer and defend Rabba, that Hochanami, that even though, according to the Doraisa law, her Cheskas Hetel Shuk tells me that she doesn't require Chalitza, but nevertheless, l'chumra, we're going to require as a chumra d'Rabbanan Chalitza in a case of Safek. Now we get back to the old discussion. Hare chumra the asil de kulahu. Why? Because in the eyes of the spectator, once you require Chalitza, then it means that she is a Yevama. There is a Zikasim and a Chobas Yevama, and therefore he might go ahead and be Miyabim. Now, if he's Miyabim her, she has a Cheskes Hetel Shuk, means she has a Chazokes Tzaras Erva, and therefore there's no Yibum, there's no Zika, and she remains Eishes Achiv with an Isa Kares. So the Gemara defends Rava by saying the following. We're going to differentiate between the case of Safek Gerushin and the case of Nefilas Habayis. In the case of Gerushin Shchichi, Gerushin is something, unfortunately, that is, relatively common. They talk about a tragedy of a nebuch of a house that collapsed. That's a fluke. That's something that's not shchia. Is therefore in the case of Gerushin, the shchichi gozu bei Rabbanan. The Rabbanan instituted a suffix that maybe the Gerushin was chal, in which case Sarah would require yibum. Just 1 second. Gozu bei Rabbanan. What's the case again? In the case, he gave a suffix in, and now we're going to say that. Oh, and we're going to implement the chazak of hetel shuk. We don't have the luxury and the possibility of requiring chalitza, because maybe if we require chalitza, we have to worry about the fact that he might come to do yibum, violating Eshes Ach, when in fact, based on Cheskes Hetel Shuk, she has the status of a Tzoras Erva, and she doesn't fall for yibum. And that's shchiach. So since it's shchiach, is milsa shchicha le'rabbanan, gazru be'rabbanan. But mapolis lo shchichi, lo gazru be'rabbanan, we're not going to worry that if we require chalitza, it might come to yibum. Therefore, even though her chazaka is a cheskes hetel shuk, which means that yibum would be a violation of Eshes Ach, but still, since what? Since it's possible that Shimon died first, we have to require chalitza. You'll tell me if we require chalitza, then chas v'sholom he might come to be miyabim her, which might be a violation of Eshes Ach on the tzad that Shimon died first. The answer is that b'makom the lo shchiach lo gazu be'rabban. So that's the first answer. Inami. Now the Gemara is looking for an alternative distinction between Safik Gerushin and Safik Nefilas Habayis. Gerushin, the Kaima Erva, right? The Erva is alive and well. That's Rivka, who received that Safek Gerushin situation. They call Mochach. In other words, we look at Rivka, and we know that Rivka is an erva to Ruvain, and since she's staring us in the face, we assume, therefore, that Sarah is a tzaras erva, and therefore we apply the principle of cheskes hetel shuk, and she can get married. Vitzarasa kamatzrich la chalitza. Just 1 second. Just 1 second. I lost the mathematics here for a second. Just give me a minute. Kamatzrich la chalitza. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Kamatzrich la chalitza means if you would require chalitza. Okay, I think. You'll tell me if your translation will support. If you're kamatzrich la chalitza, if you're going to go ahead and require chalitza, then what impact is that going to have on the spectator? What conclusion will he draw? Amri, they will say, Rabbanan begita. The Rabbanan investigated that get, and they concluded the Gita Ma'al. And that's why Sarah now is no longer Tzaras Erva, because the get to the Erva to Rivka was valid, and the Rabbanan checked it out. And that's why they're requiring Chalitza, because if the get was valid, then Sarah is no longer a Tzaras Erva, therefore she falls to Yibum, she requires Chalitza. And then the Osuli Bume Litzar. Now we get back to that Gzera, that if you're requiring Chalitza, people will think that it's a full-fledged Nefil Yibum, and therefore Osuli Bume Litzar. So Litzar here I think means Sarah. So that's the danger of instituting a gzera of chalitza. That's going to be a chumra she'asili day kul. And why? In the first answer we said because it's shchia. Now we're saying another answer because the tzara is mocha, and she's right there, alive and well. But not in the case of Mapoles, and we don't know who died first. Now we're not worried. We don't have this chashash. Why? Because mi kamale rabbanim b'Mapoles. Mi kamale means who could know. Who could know, even if the rabbanim do all the investigation, but the house fell on both of them, there may have been a fraction of a second of a difference in terms of who perished first. So now, since the Rabbanan could not possibly know what's going on, then when the people see chalitza, they're not going to say, well, the Rabbanan investigated and came to the absolute conclusion that Rivka died first. I mean, that might be the natural conclusion. Rivka must have died first if there's a zikas yibum to Sarah. But no. They'll understand maturely very well that sophisticated they are, that the reason why we're requiring chalitza is because no one could ever know which of the two died first. You know, they called all the ambulances and everything. Nobody could, it doesn't say on the, what's it called, the coroner's, documents to say who died first. So they're going to say that chalitza is a chalitza suffix. So once they understand and appreciate that it's a suffix situation because we can never know who died first, then we don't have to be choshesh that in that suffix situation anyone would allow yibum to take place. Because once it's a suffix, then you have to assume that maybe she doesn't require chalitza. She is a tzaras erva, and he died first, Shimon died first, and therefore, as far as Sarah is concerned, being a tzaras erva means that we have the erva of Eishes A. So the Gemara, just to summarize, gives two justifications or reconciliations for Rabba Shita that in the case of Safek Gerushin, we're not going to require chalitza, whereas in the case of Mapoles, we do require chalitza, as codified by the Mishnah later on. In the case of the Fields Bias, is Sarasa Choletzes V'lo B'Syet. Okay, where are we up to now? He has a one-line introduction to the next piece of Gemara. Here in the Masechet he writes, "HaGemara maksha al Rabba she'amar she'ena choletzes and hemid sheyesh l'chalik bein safek mapoles l'safek gerushin." Meaning, although Rabba was able to defend himself against the objection from the Mishnah Mapoles, what's he going to do with the following Mishnah, which is not here in Masechet Yevamot, but it's in Masechet Gittin, and that's a case of Safek Gerushin. Well, Gabi Gerushin Bilo Tnan, we're going to require chalitza in order to permit Sarah to get married. But Tnan, Hoisa Omedes B'Saravin, Uzrako Law, Karav Law Megureshes, Karav Law Eina Megureshes, Metzal Mechza, Megureshes, the Eina Megureshes, Ramina Lamai Hilchasa, the Kohen who, the Kohen who, Asurale, and Ervahi, Sarasa Boy Chalitza. So again, in this case of Safek, if the husband is a Kohen, he can never remarry her because maybe she's a Grusha. That's, there's a famous case where a man put a get into an envelope in front of Bezdin, and he put the envelope on the desk, and he said to his wife, "You got a letter." He addressed it to her on the outside. Maybe the stamp had a seal on. I don't know what. She picks up the envelope, she opens it up, and she has a get. And the question came up, and Reb Chaim immediately said, "Is he a Kohen?" I mean, that's a catchphrase in Hilchos Gittin. Is he a Kohen means it's a Safek Gerish. Whenever you want to say something's a Safek Get, the first thing you ask is the Baal a Kohen? Because we're in deep trouble if the Baal is a Kohen. If the Baal is a Yisrael, then he has two options. He can either give a replacement get and do it better, do it right, get it right this time, or he can remarry her. But that option doesn't exist in the case of a Kohen. Now, what we're more interested is ervahi. So what we have here is a case where the husband has two wives and he dies without children, and he's got an erva who's a safek megureshes. When we say erva, we mean an erva on the other brother, right? Is here it says tzarasa, meaning Sarah, boy chalitza. So she does require chalitza to be safek. Here's a Mishnah which is explicit that in the case of a safek gerushin to the erva, the Sarah requires chalitza. Because again, if the gerushin's chal is valid to Rivka, then Sarah is no longer Sarah's erva, she falls to Yibam. So therefore, we must require chalitza, and this is against Rabbah, because Rabbah said the Safek gerushin, since she has a cheskas muteres l'shuk, until this point in time, we knew and we established that she was a tzaras erva. Therefore, we don't change that status unless we have a vada, but not in a safek. And therefore, she doesn't require even chalitza. She's muteres l'shuk because of a cheskas etel l'shuk. V'lo amrinon. And we don't say Shemata Omer Choletzes Misyabemis. We don't apply in this Mishnah the logic of Rabbah, the principle of Rabbah, namely that if you're going to go ahead and require Chalitza Mitzad Safek, when the Torah doesn't require Chalitza, then we have to worry about the possibility that the misunderstanding will come about and there'll be evil. And in case the Gerushin was Chal, just 1 second. I'm sorry, in case the Gerushin was not Chal, then she's a Tzaras Erva, and if he was Miyabim her, he violates the Iser Erva Vachos Ishta. For answers Ha'idmar Allah, we have a statement of both Rabbah and Rav Yosef in conjunction with that Mishnah in Masechet Gittin. The Amri Chavayu, they both agree that the Mishnah is not a case where the Eidim saw the throwing of the get. They know exactly where it fell. In which case, both the Baal and the Isha have, let's say if it fell right in the middle, in a place where both the Baal and the Isha have access to the get. But rather, what's the case? So again, the classic case before Rabbah and Rav Yosef would have been to interpret the Mishnah as a case where both the Baal and the Isha have equal shmira rights or abilities to the get. And therefore, we don't know whether the get ever left the rishus of the Baal. And that's a pure suffering. So in such a case, we're going to apply the chazaka rule, meaning Sarah has a chazaka muteres l'shuk, and Rivka has a chazaka that she is still married to Shimon, meaning that the get was not valid. But what was the case of the Mishnah? Right, and again, if the get is not valid because of the chazaka, then there's no need for chalitza. And what are we going to do with the Mishnah that says So Rasa boy chalitza. Wow. This is what's called trey utrey. Achas omeres karav lo. Achas omeres karav lo. The havile speak do rice. Now, what happens in Sveika Doraisa? We have to underline these two words, Sveika Doraisa, because these two words have a deeper meaning, a more powerful meaning. Sveika Doraisa, if you read it, Kipshuto, doesn't mean a thing. I mean, everything that we've been dealing with is a Safek Doraisa. But what Sveika Doraisa means is that we completely null and discount all chazakas. The entire episode of Chazaka in the Encyclopedia Talmudit, there are 2 volumes on Chazaka. Just forget about those 2 volumes. That's called Isura Dorais. That's called Speika Dorais. So when was it that Rava said that she doesn't need Chalitza? That was a case where Rava was activating Chazakas. She was muteres l'shuk. She remains muteres l'shuk despite the get, and we're not going to validate the get. And that's called uki gavra aches kasa. But sveika doraisa means forget about all chazakas. It's a pure suffix, and in a pure suffix, even Rava will agree that she needs chalitza. When the Ikar Din is that she doesn't fall for Yibum, she's Becheskes, Saras Erva, and she has a chazak of Muteris L'Shuk. Certainly we don't need Chalitza. And if you're going to tell me, well, let's require Chalitza as a Chumrah, it's a Chumrah Shasim Dekula. But Rab is going to agree in the case of Trey Utrey that since we have a Sveika Doraisa, the chazak is completely null and void. It has no significance whatsoever. And therefore, we have a pure suffix. And a pure suffix requires chalitza. Now, let's go back to Rabbah. Rabbah says in our Mishnah, if it would have been a case of suffix in Gerushin, meaning suffix karav lo, karav la, then she would not require chalitza. Why isn't that speika doraisa? So the answer is masisa d'halav kasachas. We're not talking about trade. There's only one pair of edim at the time of the Maisa. Let's take, for example, the Reisha of Zarak la Kedushin, Safek Karav Lo, Safek Karav La. So you have a Kasachas. Oh, wait a minute. He says something here in the name of Rashi. I'm not sure. I think I'd want to leave this out for a moment. Let's see. Just 1 second. Right. I think we're going to go. I think in this case, I mean, I'll explain to you why I'm doing this. We're going to go with the Rashi. Usually we go with Rashi and then we add another possibility of the Rashi. But here I think the main thrust of the sugya should be understood like the Rashba, not like Rashi, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. So what is the Rashba explaining as sugya? There are 2 witnesses, and they both testify identical that the get fell or the kedushin fell in a suffix karav lo, suffix karav lo. So he threw out kesef or star, and it landed in a place where we cannot know whether it's closer to him or closer to her. Let's say the wind blew away the get or the kedushin immediately after the mice. That's called, in the case of kedushin, safek kedushin. So why do I insist on the Rashba, not Rashi? Rashi says that one of the two witnesses says that the kedushin came closer to her, and the other that it came closer to him. That's impossible for two reasons. First of all, because Hakchasha would absolutely disqualify the testimony. We don't have a kat. And secondly, in Kedushin, you need two Eidim. You don't have two Eidim on Kedushin. Only one Eid, according to Rashi, is testifying that it came Karav law. That's meaningless. So therefore, we're going to go with the Rashba's pshat, that the two Eidim are testifying the same identical testimony, that it fell in a place where you cannot know whether it was closer to him or closer to her. So at the end of the day, Ein kan shnei Eidim sheniskadsha ha'erva. Like now we're talking about the case of Kedushin to Rivka, who's an erva to Ruvain. And therefore, mamidim es saros al cheskes heter shemuteres liyavam minatorah. Right? You're going to say that the kedushin between Shimon and Rivka was valid, making Sarah into an ice Sarah's erva, and therefore falling for Yibum, and she can't marry anyone minat shur. No. We're going to leave her, according to Rabbah, in a cheskas heter l'shur. Just 1 second. No, not heter l'shur. In this case of Kedushin, it's heter l'mayah. I'm sorry, we're talking about Kedushin. Right? In Gerushin, we're talking about heter l'chuk, and in Kedushin, we're talking about cheskas heter l'yavam. So the two Eidim who end up with a suffix, they both agree that we don't know where the Kedushin fell. They cannot create Kedushin. And if they cannot create Kedushin, then Sarah remains Becheskes Heter L'Yama because she's not at Sarah's erva. Havilei Sveika the Rabbanon. So the Rabbanon are going to be machmir, and they're going to block Yibum and require Chalitza. So now we come back to, again, reiterate the position of Rabbah, that the Mishnah did not mention a case of Safek Gerushin of Karav, Safek Karav Lo, Safek Karav Lo, as they did in the Reisha by Kedushin. And why is that? Because in the case of Gerushin, we're going to rely on the Cheskes Heter L'Shur. And the Rabbanan are not going to be machmir to require Chalitza, because of this chashash that people say, well, if she has chalitza, maybe she should be allowed to have Yibum as well. Mashenkin, in the case of Safek Kedushin, right? Safek Kedushin, just 1 second. And in Safek Gerushin, we're going to say she has a chezkas heter l'shur. So, right, suffix. So again, now let's go over this. In the case of Kedushin, it's a chezkas hetel yavam. In the case of Gerushin, it's a chezkas hetel shur. So in the case of Kedushin, since it's a suffix, since there's a chazaka of hetel yavam, I think what the Gemara is saying here, this is, Beiravon Mukbal here. I think what the Gemara is saying is that in the case of Safi Kedusha, we're not going to apply Chazak. And why don't we apply Chazaka? After all, she has a Cheskes Hetul Yavam. And the answer is Sfeika D'Rabbana. Sfeika D'Rabbana. And therefore, we require Chalitza. Right? And we will prohibit Yibum. But on a Doraisa level, let's just go back to the Doraisa for a second. She has, on a Doraisa level, she has a Cheskes Hetel Yavam in the case of Kiddush. Because there was no erva in the picture. So even in the worst scenario, when you prohibit Yibum, and mistakenly, since you require Chalitza, they will think that Yibum is okay, there's no tragedy. Right? Because she has a Cheskes Hetel Yoma. But in the case of Gerushin, there, her Chazaka was that she has a Cheskes Hetel Shur, which means that Ruvain is an erva to her of an Ashes Af, because she was married to his brother Shimon and there's no Yibum. And there, according to Rabbi's interpretation, if we require Chalitza, we're in deep trouble because it might come to you. So Gemara says, "Umimai the masnisin da'acha be kas achas." Why do you assume that in our Mishnah, as opposed to the Mishnah in Gittin, we're talking about one kat? And if there's one kat, then we go back to Chazaka, and then we compare the two Chazakas. Maybe the Mishnah is talking about trade traces, and that would make it into a Tzveika Doraisa. And then we must require Chalitza. And again, if we're talking about trade, and that's why we're requiring Chalitza, we can apply the same logic to Safek Gerish. Why did the Mishnah mention Safek Gerish? The Gemara answers, Dumya de Kiddushin. Kiddushin b'kas achas. Af Gerishin b'kas achas. So that's why I was about to ask these questions. The Gemara is assuming that in Kiddushin is Bekasa. Why does the Gemara assume that in Kiddushin is Bekasa? Kiddushin gufayu mimai de Bekasachas, dilma b'shtei kite edim. And the Gemara answers the E b'sofek shel shtei kite edim tisyabem v'ein bekach klum. Right, because we said that in Shtei Kitei Edim, One second. Why is Tisyabim v'ein b'kach klum? I don't get it. Why is Tisyabim v'ein b'kach klum? Can you help me with this, Rabbosai? Maybe you have a note on this. If it's shteki ve'edim, then Tisyabim v'ein b'kach klum. What's going on here? Tisyabim, she might be a tsaras erva with an Yitzer Karetz. What's going on here?
No, they're just retainer chazaka.
There's no chazaka. So we said Sveika Dorais. Oh, he says here, Hikshu Atosfis, Eich ol al das hamakshid shetisyabim b'trei u'trei, Ari l'dvar trei Sveika Dorais. Oh, v'yein l'smoch al cheskes hetel yavam, och shekivanti. I don't know if you have such a footnote.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he has a very sophisticated answer here. Very. But you see, the language here is Eich Ol Al Das, meaning this Gemara of Tisyabim Ve'im B'kach Klum doesn't make sense as a Havamim, but we are going to reject it. So at least we can breathe easily from the Maskana. Right? So the Gemara is saying, okay, Kaime Edim. Oh, Kaime Edim, I think means that there's one kind of Edim that it has to find Kar of law. And if it's Kar of law, then Sarah becomes an Erva. You follow me? It's Sarah's Erva as far as Zibu and an Erva Veshesach to Shimon, to Reuven. So how can you say Tisyabim Ve'im B'kach Klum, Vat Amr Tisyabim Ve'im B'kach Klum, question mark. So Tosfos is bothered by the Havamim. That's where the Rashba comes up with a very sophisticated answer, very complicated answer to defend the Havamim. Maybe we'll look at the Rashba. But he says, V'ad Amr Tisyabim Ve'im B'kach Klum, through okay, now we're up to Vesu. If it's not complicated enough as it is, now we get to Vesu. Vesu. Eki de Edim Nami Sveika de Rabbanan he. I'm reading Uki Trey, Ba'ad Trey, the Isha Ukma, Achazaka. Wow. Says the following: Od Kasha, Al Mashe Chilku, Bein Sofik Shel Kas Achas, the Bein Sofik Shel Trey Trey, the Omrish of the Sofik Shel Trey Trey, Gam Begerishin, Choletzes, Kevan Shu Sveika Doraisa, Ve'ein Ma'amidin Os Al Cheskasa, Valo B'Sofik Shel Trey Kite Edim Nami Sveika D'Rabbanan. Why is Gemara assuming it's Sveika D'Rabbanan? I mean, until now we've been assuming that it's Sveika D'Oraisa. He says the Midoraisa Amrinon Uki Trey Levadi Trey. Is therefore Isha Ukri Achazoka Shalonis Garish. He says, for Choseres Hakusha, Kevan Shematzinu She'im Nisgarsha Ha'erva, Safik Gerishin, Safik Karvlo, Safik Karvlo, Tzarasa, Choletzes, Lomis Yabemes. And then we're back to square one. Why doesn't the Mishnah say this? So I don't understand. At this point, the Gemara is shifting. I'm not sure why. Shifting from its original understanding of Trey, that Trey is a Safik Doraisa, in which case Chazaka is irrelevant and it's impotent. And now the Gemara is saying, no, Trey is Fake Rabbana. And therefore, on a Doraisa level, we will apply Chazaka. What made the Gemara all of a sudden wake up to another position, which is the polar opposite of everything we've been assuming until now? I mean, he writes here, Ha'edim Chomru T'nafel Karav Law, which makes Sarah into an Erva. He says, Kevan she'ein ha'edim yicholim lachriya, I guess because it's Trey, so you can't, there's no achra in a case of Trey, is therefore, with the Raisa Isha Ukmach, now he's going back to Chazaka, that's called Sfeik D'Rabbanan. But I don't get it. What made the Gemara make this shift over here? I don't get it. Does anybody say anything there? All of a sudden the Gemara is we've been learning Tzveika D'Oraisa. All of a sudden it became a Tzveika D'Rabbanan. How did that happen? Did I blink?
This reflects in about face in reasoning.
Why did the Gemara make it about face? I don't get it.
It doesn't say why it is, it just says it is. At the end, I mean,
Maybe the Gemara, I don't know, I'm afraid to say this, but maybe the Gemara is rejecting the whole concept of Tzveika D'Oraisa, which is such that's like a basic fundamental concept that we always operate with when it comes to trade. Trade is Tzveika D'Oraisa. The Gemara is now rejecting the whole svara of Tzveika D'Oraisa, which is pretty wild.
the last sentence, two witnesses are opposed by another two.
Right.
In a situation of uncertainty exists, the principle of chazaka dictates the law.
Okay. So it's a whole new approach. Because I'll tell you, the way I was always trained, and that's why I'm a big fan of Tzveika D'Oraisa, means you can't talk about chazaka. Chazaka is meaningful if you don't have Eidim to contradict the chazaka. Once you have Eidim to contradict this, even though we don't know whether these Eidim are telling the truth or not, but the Torah says that you rely on two Eidim. He's assuming that since another two Eidim are contradicting these two Eidim, the original two Eidim are ki'ilu null and void, and then we go back to chazakas. I'm just curious as to why the Gemara all of a sudden made it about face. Unless that's the next line in the Gemara, Midi Dahav, the Midi Dahav means that the Gemara had another. I don't know what is it. Is it a Mishnah? I'm not sure. I don't think it's a Mishnah, but Mira Nichse the Barshatya, right? The Barshatya Zovin Nichse Osu Beitrei V'Amrik Shu Cholim Zov Nosu Beitrei V'Amrik Shu Shotim Zov V'Yom Rav Ashi Uki Trey Lavadi Trey, and without even turning the page, I can tell you what's going to come on the next side of the page. On the next side of the page, and it's going to say the Uki Karka or Uki Mamona v'Cheskas Marakam. So you see that even in Trey, it's not a Tzveika D'Oraisa. Let's see what the Gemara says. The Ari Uki v'Cheskas Barshati. Is that a Mishnah? What is that? I don't think it's a Mishnah. It's some sort of like a psak. It's almost like a Kabbalah, Allah Moshe Sinai of some sort. Ukme'ara b'cheskes parshacha, kol b'cheskes hamocher, shu amar kama shel hakarka, harei shegam b'sofik shel trei mamidim al chazok l'meikora. V'af binyonenu yesh lahames ha'isha b'cheskasa, shehi tzaras erva, v'tei muteres l'shuk. Umizeh shegozru rabbanan b'braisa, shetachlov, nira shelo chashashu shem yomru mitoch shecholetzes misyabemes. No mar adin shel safek harav lo safek harav lo shecholetzes. Okay, so this is where I think we'll stop here because we really came to like a tachana sofit over here. I mean, the Gemara has completely smashed Rabbah because of the possibility of trey, and we're holding Sveika D'Rabbanan. And if we're holding Sveika D'Rabbanan, then Midoraisa Uki Gabra B'cheskas Meikara, the original Chazaka, which is that she's a Tzaras Erva, and therefore what? We should require Chalitz. And we're not worried about, somebody coming along and saying, well, if you require chalitza, let's go a step further and allow yibum. And this woman's original chazaka is that of Tzaras Erva. So again, we're back to square one. We don't have an answer to the original question that Rabbah tried to answer, why the Mishnah in Gerushin in the Sefer didn't mention a case of Safek Harav Lo, Safek Harav. I see the next word in the Gemara is Ella, so I'm assuming that at this point they're throwing Rabbah out because that's what the word Ella means. Ella usually means that we reject everything that came before. So let's be held in suspense until tomorrow. Okay, then I wish you a great day. Thank you so much.